My family is 6 seconds away from ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. On the giant screen behind them, the company they stole from me shines in white and gold like a monument built to a lie. Aurelion Encryption, IPO valuation, $6.4 billion. The anchors are almost breathless. They keep using words like trust, discipline, vision, and resilience, as if repeating noble language often enough can clean the fingerprints off theft. My father is standing in the center, shoulders back, chin up, wearing the expression he only ever uses when money is nearby. My mother stands beside him, one hand lightly touching his arm, smiling the way she learned to smile at fundraisers, charity dinners, and every room where people with power like to be reassured that wealth belongs to the tasteful. My sister Elise is on his other side in a cream suit with a perfect posture she did not earn and a confidence she never had until she discovered that proximity to genius can be sold as competence if the real genius is shut out of frame. They look beautiful from a distance. That is the problem with distance. It flatters predators. I'm watching from a basement apartment in Queens where the ceiling leaks when it rains and the radiator only works if I kick it twice on the right side. The room smells like cold dust, burnt coffee, and old wiring. There's a stain in the corner where the previous tenant tried and failed to convince mold it wasn't welcome. My desk is an old wooden door laid across 2 filing cabinets I found on the sidewalk last winter. The mattress behind me sits directly on the floor because the bed frame cracked 3 months ago and I decided groceries mattered more than dignity. On my left monitor, CNBC is broadcasting my family's victory. On my right monitor, every dollar I have left is sitting inside put options that expire tomorrow. In the center, the only screen that matters is black. No logo. No dashboard. No polished interface designed to make dangerous things look friendly. Just 4 lines of green text. Kernel survival timer, active. Manual root renewal, not received. Lifeline status, critical. Time remaining, 0:58 and 16 seconds. My phone vibrates against the desk hard enough to rattle the mug beside it. Dad. I let it ring. On TV, the camera zooms in as my father leans toward one of the exchange officials and laughs at something I can't hear. From here he looks exactly like what the market wants him to be, controlled, experienced, inevitable. He spent the last 3 years learning how to wear leadership the way some men learn to wear expensive suits, badly at first, then convincingly enough that people stop checking whether anything underneath it is real. The truth is simpler. My father has never built a thing in his life. He has acquired, maneuvered, borrowed, pitched, repackaged, and survived. He has mistaken appetite for talent for as long as I have known him. When he was younger, he burned through startup trends the way weak men always do when they think success is just a sequence of rooms they haven't entered yet. Crypto. Venture placements. AI funds. Private advisory schemes. Every failure was temporary in his mind, every collapse the fault of timing or partners or insufficient belief from lesser people. The only thing he ever did with consistency was stay close to value until he found a way to call it his. That strategy finally worked when he found me. My phone stops. A second later, another vibration. Mom. I ignore that too. Then a text message arrives. Call me now. The engineers are seeing a survival warning in the kernel. I stare at the screen for a moment and feel something inside me settle into place. Not excitement. Not satisfaction. Not even anger. Recognition. They know enough to be afraid now. Good. 3 years ago, my family took my encryption kernel, my company, my place in the world, and the right to tell the truth about any of it. They did not do it with knives or screaming or cinematic malice. They did it the cleaner way. Paperwork. Concern. Controlled voices. Family language. They took something I built with my own hands and translated it into a structure where my name became decorative, then disposable. After that they pushed me out, rewrote my role, and taught everyone around us to call me unstable so no one would ask why the original architect of Aurelion had vanished from its leadership overnight. But they never understood the kernel. That was their fatal mistake. The thing on that stage is not a software company. It is not a brand. It is not an enterprise security platform. It is a living encryption core I built when I was 18 because I had become obsessed with one idea. Every system in the world is designed to protect itself from outsiders, but almost none are designed to protect themselves from the people already inside. Executives. Founders. Board members. Trustees. Family. The ones with titles, passwords, signatures, and enough social polish to make abuse look like governance. I knew better even then. Power is not legitimacy. Authority is not proof. Possession is not innocence. So I built the Aurelion kernel to distrust power by default. Not rhetorically. Architecturally. Every chain of trust had to remain alive through continuous verification. Every elevated privilege had to justify itself over time. Every command, every override, every attempt to inherit authority from the layer above it was subject to scrutiny deeper than titles. The kernel did not care who you were. It only cared whether your authority could still be proven without contradiction. That design made it strong. It also made it dangerous. Because once you build a system honest enough to distrust everyone, you eventually realize it must also distrust the people who own it. Especially them. That was where the survival path came from. Buried below the visible authorization model, below recovery, below governance, below every polished feature my sister later used in investor demos, I built one private root renewal key. Once every 365 days, the original architect had to feed the key into the kernel and confirm that the trust structure above it still deserved to survive. Me. If the key arrived, the kernel continued. Quietly. Gracefully. No one noticed. The company kept making money. The layers above it kept pretending they were sovereign. If the key did not arrive, the system started withdrawing recognition. Not immediately. Not dramatically. That would be amateur cruelty. First, root continuity began to decay. Then trust inheritance started failing at the executive layer. Administrative permissions looked valid while the structures beneath them quietly weakened. Recovery ladders began authenticating without restoring real legitimacy. And once enough weight sat on top of a foundation that no longer believed in the people commanding it, the whole machine started doing something colder than sabotage. It refused. That is what my family is celebrating this morning. A public company that still needs my private consent to survive. On TV, my mother turned slightly toward the cameras, smiling with the warmth she reserves for rooms where other people's money is trying to decide whether to love her. It still amazes me how good she became at helping dress the lie. She used to stand at the laundry room door when I was building the early versions of the kernel, asking if I had eaten, asking if I was sleeping, asking in that soft voice whether I understood how dangerous the world was for boys like me. She turned concern into a management style. Turned affection into compliance. If my father knew how to hunt value, my mother knew how to tranquilize it. Elise learned faster than either of them. She was the first one to ask the question that mattered, not how does it work, not what does it change, but how can this be sold? She did not build Aurelion. She built the language around Aurelion that made institutions feel safe buying something they did not understand from people who did not deserve to own it. And now all three of them are standing together under exchange lighting like they invented trust itself. My right monitor updates. The options chain flashes green and red as volume surges. The stock hasn't started trading yet, but appetite is building. That part was always predictable. Markets are just greed with better tailoring. If you tell enough powerful people that you have solved fear, they will throw money at the promise before they ask whether the promise is structurally sound. They are about to learn. My phone lights up again. A new text from my father this time. Pick up. Now. What does manual root renewal not received mean? I read it once, then again, and feel my mouth curve into something that isn't quite a smile. He knows the words, he still doesn't know the meaning. That is the shape of his entire life. On the television, the host starts the countdown. 5. 4. Traders below the balcony are already clapping. 3. My father reaches for the bell rope. 2. My mother's smile widens. 1. He pulls. The bell rings. The floor erupts. The anchors cheer. The cameras flash. On my left monitor, Aurelion opens green, surging upward into the kind of perfect public birth my family spent 3 years building toward. And on the screen in front of me, the timer keeps counting down. Because deep inside the engine they stole from me, beneath the valuation, beneath the board, beneath the branding, beneath the polished mythology and the public applause, the kernel has already begun to ask the only question that matters. Do the people in power still deserve to survive it? For the first time in 3 years, the answer is no. I built the first version of the Aurelion kernel in a room no one else in the family wanted. It was supposed to be a laundry room. That was the official story. In reality, it was a concrete box at the back of my grandmother's house in Yonkers with exposed pipes overhead, one narrow window facing a rusted fence, and a drain in the floor that smelled faintly of bleach, mold, and old soap no matter how many times I cleaned it. In winter, the cold came up through the concrete and sat in your bones. In summer, the room trapped heat so thoroughly that the air itself seemed to get tired. There were 2 folding tables, 1 dying fan, 3 second-hand monitors, and a whiteboard I rescued from a school that had thrown it out. I loved it. At 18, I loved any place where nobody expected me to explain myself. That room was where Aurelion began. Not as a company. Not as a product. Not as a line in a market report or a category in a banker's pitch deck. It began as an obsession. A problem I could not let go of even when it was ruining my sleep, my health, and whatever small chance I had left it looking normal. I had spent months taking apart security systems and reading incident reports the way other people read crime novels. The pattern kept repeating itself. Everyone was obsessed with the threat from outside. Hackers. Nation-states. Organized crime. Rogue actors. Important threats, yes. But not the deepest one. The real breach almost always came from inside the perimeter. From the person who already had the badge, the credentials, the board authority, the legal right to touch what should never be touched. Someone who believed that because they had power, the system should trust them by default. I wanted to build something that refused to make that mistake. So I built a kernel that never granted trust permanently. Not to users. Not to admins. Not to executives. Not even to the architect who wrote it. Every privilege had to remain alive through continuous verification. Every chain of authority had to keep proving itself over time. Every elevation, every override, every attempt to inherit legitimacy from the layer above it had to pass through scrutiny deep enough to ignore vanity, titles, and presentation. That was the beauty of it. The Aurelion kernel did not care what story people told about themselves. It only cared whether their authority could still be proven without corruption. The first time I got the recursive trust map to rotate cleanly under load without breaking the cipher integrity model, I stayed awake for 33 hours. I still remember the exact moment the simulation stabilized. The test environment had 3 seeded compromises buried in different levels of the network. 1 executive credential. 1 inherited admin token. 1 internal policy chain altered at the governance layer. The kernel identified the contaminated trust path, severed the inheritance, isolated the corruption, preserved the uncontaminated sectors, and kept the rest of the system standing. No panic. No brute force shutdown. Just cold discrimination. It was beautiful. I sat there staring at the monitor with my hands shaking and felt that rare kind of certainty only builders ever get, the certainty that you have dragged something real into the world, something heavier than hype and cleaner than ambition. Then my family found out. At first, they only noticed because I stopped functioning like a person. I skipped meals, forgot conversations, answered questions halfway, and disappeared downstairs for 16-hour stretches with my headphones on and coffee going cold beside the keyboard. My mother started coming down to the laundry room with food and a carefully arranged expression of concern. My father started lingering at the door after work, pretending to admire the intensity. My sister Elise would stand with one shoulder against the frame, arms folded, looking at the monitors the way people look at expensive engines they don't understand but already want credit for discovering. The first one to smell money was Elise. That should have surprised me more than it did. She watched a containment simulation one night while I was explaining trust inheritance, and the first thing out of her mouth was not how does it work or why is this different. It was, could banks buy this? I remember the exact feeling that passed through me. Not fear. Not yet, just a small cold flicker behind the ribs, like instinct trying to warn me in a language I was still too proud to take seriously. My father came downstairs more often after that. He started bringing coffee, protein bars, the occasional new monitor cable, tiny gestures of support designed to make his interest look paternal instead of acquisitive. He would sit on an overturned detergent crate while I explained the kernel's behavior under stress, nodding in the right places even when I knew he was only understanding every third sentence. So if someone at the top gets compromised, he asked once, the system stops trusting them even if they still have all the credentials? If their authority can't survive verification, yes. Even if they own the company? Especially then. That answer made him go very still. Not offended. Interested. I see it clearly now. That was the moment he understood the product not as technology, but as leverage. He did not hear architecture. He heard contracts. Government clients. Enterprise licensing. Acquisition multiples. He looked at my kernel the way failing men look at lifeboats. They don't admire them, they calculate whether they can get there first and tell everyone else they built them. But at 18, I still wanted to believe in family. I still wanted to believe that if the people closest to you saw something extraordinary in your hands, their first instinct would be to protect you, not the value radiating off what you made. That was my first great weakness. Not naivety exactly. Need. I had spent most of my life being the strange one. The difficult one. The boy who vanished into code and came back with eyes too tired and answers too sharp. Aurelion was the first thing I ever made that caused my family to look at me with something that resembled respect. Or what I mistook for respect. My mother began asking smarter questions after that. Not technical questions. Strategic ones. Had I thought about patent protection? Market theft? Litigation risk? What if some larger company saw the kernel, copied the idea, and buried me under lawyers before I had time to breathe? She would sit on the chair by the whiteboard, one leg crossed neatly over the other, and ask in the gentlest voice imaginable whether I really thought the world was safe for boys who made things better than powerful men. It was a brilliant manipulation because part of it was true. The world is not safe for boys like that. Especially if their family notices the value before the world does. My father was more direct. He talked about timing, scale, investors, structure. He said genius gets eaten when it stays naive. He said invention without protection is just bait. He said all I needed to do was keep building and let the adults make sure nobody stole what I had made. That is how it begins in families like mine. Not with violence. With translation. They do not seize the thing immediately. They first convince you that you need them standing between your brilliance and the world. What I did not understand then was that my family had already made a private decision. Aurelion was no longer something I was building. It was something they had found. And in my family, discovered things were never left with the people who made them. They were managed. Protected. Structured. Eventually taken. I just didn't know that yet. At 18, sitting in a converted laundry room with my hands still trembling from the first clean simulation, all I knew was that I had built a machine honest enough to distrust power. I had no idea how soon I would need it to distrust my own blood. The theft did not begin with paperwork. It began with care. That is the part I still hate the most, because if they had come at me honestly, if my father had simply walked into the laundry room one night and said, I see what this is worth, and I'm going to take it from you, then at least the violence would have had the decency of a recognizable face. But my family never did violence that way. They preferred cleaner methods. Methods that left no blood and plenty of plausible affection. My mother went first. She started bringing dinner downstairs every night, setting the plate beside my keyboard, and asking questions in a voice so soft it made caution feel rude. Had I thought about incorporation? Had I considered how exposed I was as an individual inventor? Did I understand what would happen if some larger company saw the kernel, borrowed the architecture, and buried me in litigation before I ever got to launch? She said it all as if she were afraid for me rather than afraid of the value sitting in that room without her name attached to it. My father followed with the practical version of the same manipulation. He began treating me less like a son and more like a founder whose weaknesses he had professionally assessed. He pointed out the things I already knew but had never yet been cruel enough to use against myself. I was awkward in meetings. Too direct. Too technical. Too impatient with shallow questions. He said investors don't fund the smartest person in the room. They fund the person who makes them feel safest about being rich later. You have the engine, he told me one night, leaning against the dryer while I cleaned a trust map that had started propagating too aggressively. But engines don't build companies. Structures do. Structures. That word appeared everywhere after that. My mother started saying we needed a protective structure. My father said we needed a market structure. Elise said I needed adult structure if I wanted institutions to trust me with something that important. It was brilliant, in a rotten way. Structure sounds neutral. Mature. Reasonable. Who argues against structure without sounding like a child resisting medicine? That was the shape of the whole campaign. Every move they made was framed as rescue from a problem I was supposedly too young, too technical, or too strange to handle by myself. At first, their help looked almost harmless. My father began taking introductory calls with small investors because, in his words, you shouldn't have to waste your time explaining yourself to men who don't deserve the full architecture yet. My mother started handling media inquiries after a local tech blog wrote a short piece about a teenager building a trust adaptive encryption model in a Yonkers basement. Elise took over scheduling because I kept missing calls while buried inside the kernel. It all felt temporary. That is how careful theft always feels at the beginning. Temporary. Practical. Slightly annoying, maybe, but forgivable because the thing you're building still appears to be yours when you look at it from close enough range. The problem was that the range kept changing. My father started introducing Aurelion as the family company. Elise began referring to my kernel as our platform in front of potential partners. My mother told one journalist, smiling into the phone at the dining room table, that we had been working on an enterprise-grade answer to broken digital trust for over a year now. We. Every time that word appeared, I felt something tighten behind my ribs. But I said nothing. That was my most expensive habit in those months. I kept mistaking discomfort for paranoia. I kept assuming that because I could still walk downstairs and put my hands on the engine, because I could still change the trust maps, still patch the recursion model, still break and rebuild the validation layer at 2 in the morning if I needed to, the company was still mine in every way that mattered. What I failed to understand was simple. Authorship and ownership are not the same thing in the eyes of people who know how to weaponize narrative. And my family was already building narrative while I was still building the core. The real turning point came with the first serious institutional interest. It wasn't even a term sheet. Not yet. Just the kind of exploratory attention that makes weak people start seeing their reflection in future money. A boutique fund wanted a deeper technical review. A mid-market security integrator wanted to discuss licensing. A journalist from a larger outlet asked if Aurelion might become foundational infrastructure instead of just a specialized encryption product. My family reacted like a small cult watching prophecy begin to validate itself. My father got sharper. More restless. He began carrying legal folders around the house. He had meetings downtown he wouldn't fully describe and phone calls he took behind closed doors. My mother became gentler with me, which should have scared me more than it did. Elise became openly managerial. She rewrote my talking points before meetings, corrected my close, interrupted me when I became too technical in front of outsiders, and once, in front of a potential enterprise client, actually laid one hand on my forearm and said with a polished laugh, "What Adrian means is that we've designed a continuously self-verifying kernel that can scale with governance complexity." What Adrian means. I remember turning to look at her and seeing something in her face I had never named before. Not pride. Not partnership. Possession. That was the first night I seriously considered cutting them out. I sat in the laundry room until after midnight with the fan clicking uselessly in the corner and my laptop open to the earliest architecture notes, asking myself whether I had made a mistake by letting any of them get this close to the system. But then my father came downstairs with coffee and sat beside me and spoke in that low, reasonable voice he used only when he needed to appear like the last sane man in the room. "You're spooking yourself," he said. "This is what success feels like when it starts getting real. Pressure. Complexity. People asking for more than code." He paused, then looked at me with a softness I now know was rehearsed. "You think I don't know what predators look like? Adrian, I've spent my whole life watching talented people get stripped alive because they thought genius alone was enough. Let us protect you from that." There it was again. Protect. Always protect. Never share. Never trust you to lead. Never teach you. Just let us hold power until the danger passes. The problem with that sentence was that it used my real fear against me. Because he wasn't wrong about the world. Powerful people do eat inventors. Corporations do weaponize complexity. Founders do get buried under paperwork before they understand what they're signing away. My father simply neglected to mention that he planned to do it first. A week later, he walked into the laundry room carrying 3 black folders and set them down on the folding table where I usually ate noodles between compile runs. "This," he said, almost casually, "is just family protection." I looked at the folders. I looked at him. And for the first time, A voice inside me didn't whisper caution. It screamed. Because some part of me already understood what the rest of me was still trying not to know. The moment your family starts calling control love, the next thing they want is your signature. The papers were waiting for me on my 19th birthday. Even now, years later, I think that detail says everything. My mother baked a cake. My father opened champagne. Elise set the table with the kind of careful elegance she always used when she wanted an evening to feel historic. Candles. Linen napkins. Good plates brought out from the cabinet we normally ignored. The whole performance of celebration. If a stranger had walked in, they would have seen a family proud of its difficult son. Proud of what he had built. Proud of the future opening up in front of him. At the far end of the table, beside my chair, sat a black leather folder with my name embossed in gold. I noticed it before I sat down. I remember the exact feeling in my stomach when I saw it. Not fear, not yet. Something colder. Recognition. Like some part of me had already met this moment in a dream and had spent the whole day trying to warn the rest of me without words. My father waited until after the candles, after the cake, after the first round of manufactured warmth had passed. Then he reached for the folder and slid it across the table with 2 fingers and a smile so controlled it looked almost tender. Nothing dramatic, he said. Just clean up. Elise leaned back in her chair and crossed one leg over the other. Actually, it's a good thing. It means this is real now. My mother touched my wrist the way she used to when I was little and sick. We're protecting you. There was that word again. Always that word. I opened the folder. Too many pages. That was my first real thought. Too many pages for something harmless. Incorporation documents. Assignment schedules. Trust declarations. Management provisions. Licensing language. Voting authority. Patent control. The vocabulary of legal theft dressed up in elegant fonts and expensive paper so that surrender would feel like maturity. My father started talking before I had finished the second page. This creates the holding structure around the kernel and all associated intellectual property. It shields you from tax exposure, litigation risk, predatory acquisition attempts, all the things people your age shouldn't have to navigate alone. That's why the family trust sits above the operating company, Elise added. Outside investors can't get leverage if control stays centralized. Outside investors. Outside predators. Outside risk. Everything in their language was designed to keep my attention fixed in one direction, away from the obvious truth sitting quietly in the room with me. They were not asking how to keep other people from taking Aurelion. They were asking me to formalize their own ability to do it first. I kept reading. Every page made my chest tighter. On the surface, the structure sounded logical enough to disarm a young founder who still wanted to believe that love and control could coexist without becoming exploitation. The family trust would hold the core patents and kernel rights for strategic continuity. The company would license the technology through the trust. Management authority would remain with the trustees until the business reached institutional maturity. I remained the inventor, the public technical origin, the symbolic center of the story. That word is poison when lawyers use it. Symbolic means visible without being sovereign. I looked up from the stack and said the only honest thing in the room. This gives the kernel to the trust. My father answered too quickly. Temporarily. For how long? Until the board deems founder control operationally appropriate. We don't have a board. We will. That was the moment I should have stood up and walked out of the room. Because there it was, an invisible authority structure already being spoken into existence by people who had decided, long before telling me, that they would own the language of every future room Aurelion entered. Instead, I stayed seated. I was 19. Brilliant in the wrong ways. Exhausted. Socially half-formed. And my family had spent the last year constructing a story around those facts that made me feel reckless every time I questioned them. My father knew exactly how to press on that weakness. If this isn't in place now, he said, tapping the papers lightly, the first real investors who smell uncertainty will rip this apart. You think genius protects ownership? It doesn't. Structure protects ownership. Your structure, I said. Our structure, my mother corrected gently. That one landed harder than it should have. Because I knew, even then, that the correction was not semantic. It was territorial. I kept reading, faster now, trying to catch the full shape of the trap before it closed. The danger wasn't in one monstrous clause. It was in how the clauses touched each other. Assignment language tied to trustee discretion. Founder participation tied to conduct standards. Control rights drifting upward into a structure that sounded protective until you realized the protected party and the controlling party were no longer the same thing. I put the papers down. I should have a lawyer read this. Silence. It arrived instantly and perfectly, which meant they had anticipated the possibility and decided in advance how to punish it. Then Elise laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was brittle and contemptuous, the laugh of someone who thinks they have just caught a child trying on adulthood in the wrong room. A lawyer, she said. A lawyer is going to charge you $500 an hour to tell you your own family is trying to save your company from being eaten alive. My father's face hardened. Not openly. Just enough for me to see the edge beneath the performance. Adrian, listen to me very carefully. If you drag this outside the family before we secure it, you are telling every serious person in the room that you are not mature enough to manage your own success. There it was. Not reassurance. Threat. My mother squeezed my wrist. You do not have to carry this alone. That was the lie that almost got me. Not the tax language. Not the governance jargon. Not even the fear of investors. That sentence. Because I was tired. Because I was already drowning in architecture and pressure and the constant low-grade shame of feeling extraordinary in one room and unfinished in every other. Because some brutal, needy part of me wanted to believe my family really had spent the last year building a shield and not a trap. I asked one more question. If I sign this, does Aurelion still belong to me? No one answered directly. That should have been enough. Instead, my father uncapped a pen and rolled it toward me. It belongs to its future. I signed the first page. Then the second. Then the next. Each signature felt absurdly small. Just ink. Just a name I had been writing my whole life. But with every line I signed, I felt something in the room shift away from me. Not physically. Structurally. As if authority itself had started moving to a different address while I watched. When I finished, my father closed the folder immediately. Too fast. The speed of a man protecting a live explosive now that it has finally been wired correctly. He stood, leaned down, kissed the top of my head, and said the sentence that came back to me for years afterward in dreams so vivid I woke up angry. Now we can build this properly. Build, that was the word he chose. Not protect. Not secure. Not formalize. Build. As if the thing I had already made was only raw material waiting for him to become legitimate. I smiled because I still didn't fully understand what had happened. That is the ugliest truth in the whole story. I was not tricked because the documents were too complex. I was tricked because I wanted the people at that table to still be my family. 12 days later, when the locks changed and the company stopped being mine in any way the world would recognize, I finally understood what my signature had purchased. Not safety. Not structure. Not a future. Permission. Permission for my family to take my life and call it stewardship. 12 days after I signed the papers, my key stopped working. It happened at 8:43 p.m. on a Thursday in the rain. The office lobby was still lit. I could see the reflection of the reception desk through the glass, the brushed steel letters of Aurelion encryption mounted on the wall behind it, the exact wall I had argued to keep plain because I didn't want the company spending money on vanity before the core was stable enough to deserve ambition. Now the sign looked expensive. Permanent. The kind of thing people point at when they want proof that a story has become real. I swiped my card once. Red. Then again. Red. Then a third time, harder, because for a few ridiculous seconds I thought maybe force could reverse permissions. Red. The rain was running down the back of my neck and into my shirt. Cars hissed through puddles on the street behind me. Inside the lobby, the security guard looked up from his monitor, saw me, and immediately looked away. That was the first moment I knew. Not because the access had failed. Because someone had prepared the room to act like I no longer belonged in it. A minute later, my father appeared. He didn't hurry. That still matters to me. The calm of it. The composure. He didn't storm out looking ashamed or defensive or angry. He walked toward the door in a dark overcoat with the measured posture of a man arriving for a dinner reservation. The same man who had spent the last year telling me he was protecting my future now moved like someone who had already converted what he was about to do into a strategic necessity. He opened the door halfway and stood in the gap. You should have called first. For a second, the sentence didn't even make sense. I work here. He gave me a patient look. Not cruel. That would have been easier to hate. Worse than cruel. Reasonable. Not in the way that matters anymore. Those words changed the temperature of the world. I remember hearing the traffic outside. The ticking of rainwater against the glass. The dull hum of the lobby lights. I remember all of it because shock sharpens stupid details and leaves you holding them forever. What did you do? What had to be done? That was my father's greatest skill. He could compress any moral disaster into managerial language and make it sound like weather. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a separation package, a founder transition letter, and a cashier's check for $10,000. 10,000. That was the number they had landed on. The number my family believed could buy my silence, my exit, and the right to stand in front of investors pretending they had built the engine I had written alone in a room that smelled like detergent and electrical heat. I looked up at him. That's your offer? It's not an offer, he said. It's an off-ramp. Behind him, the reception monitor was cycling through a draft of the press release already prepared. Aurelion Encryption announces new executive leadership structure. Below it were 3 names. My father. My mother. Elise. Mine appeared once, farther down, as original technical innovator and foundational contributor. Foundational contributor. As if I had laid the first brick and wandered away before the building became worth claiming. You stole it, I said. My father's face tightened slightly, but his voice stayed level. We scaled it. No. I built it. You built a kernel. A difficult one. A brilliant one, yes. But not a company. Not a market-facing institution. Not something enterprise clients would trust under your leadership. That phrase, under your leadership, landed exactly where he wanted it to. It carried all the accusations my family had been soft launching for months. Too young. Too intense. Too technical. Too severe. Too strange in rooms where smooth men asked lazy questions and expected flattery instead of answers. He was not just removing me from the company. He was rearranging my own history in front of me. I want my access restored, I said. No. The Colonel won't survive if you freeze me out. That made him smile. Not warmly. Not even triumphantly. Relieved. We have engineers. I almost laughed. They had engineers the way rich people have gym memberships, symbolically. None of them had touched the core. Not really. They had built tools around it, dashboards above it, pretty layers to make enterprise buyers feel safe. But the kernel itself? The trust engine? The recursive validation core? That remained exactly what it had always been, mine, sealed inside itself, too structurally dangerous for the people now collecting salaries from it to open without fear. He knew that. That was what made the smile so obscene. He was betting not on understanding, but on distance. On the hope that he could strip me away from the perimeter and the machine would somehow forget the hand that built it. I'm not asking, I said. Move. I stepped toward the doorway. The security guard moved instantly. That was the humiliation that stayed with me longest. Not the check. Not the press release. The guard. A man in a navy blazer and a plastic earpiece placing himself between me and the company that existed because I had once stayed awake for 30 hours straight rewriting trust rotation logic on a whiteboard. He looked at me the way people look at volatility, something to contain, not understand. My father lowered his voice. Take the money. Get an apartment. Rest. Maybe finish becoming someone institutions can trust. The line was so polished it almost deserved applause. There it was at last, distilled into one sentence. My family had decided that what I built could only become legitimate once I was removed from the center of it. And then he delivered the phrase they would spend the next 3 years laundering into every boardroom, investor call, and media profile they touched. You're brilliant, Adrian. But you're unstable. And unstable founders get people hurt. That was the real killing blow. Not the lockout. Not the severance. The diagnosis. By the time the door closed, the story was already moving ahead of me. The next morning there were articles. Then calls I never got returned. Then profiles describing my father as the disciplined adult who had stepped in to stabilize a promising but fragile technical company. My mother was quoted about governance. Elise was quoted about operational maturity. I became a paragraph. A concern. A necessary transition. They did not just take my company. They took my name and replaced it with a warning label. And the worst part was how quickly the world accepted it. Because markets do not care who built the machine. They care who looks calm while standing on it. The deadbolt clicked. The guard stepped back into the lobby. The sign glowed behind the glass. And I stood in the rain holding $10,000 and the first official proof that my family had not merely betrayed me. They had erased me. The first thing to go was not my money. It was my credibility. Money leaves in stages. Slow enough that you can lie to yourself while it happens. You skip real groceries for a week and call it discipline. You move to a worse apartment and call it temporary. You sell equipment and tell yourself you can buy it back once things stabilize. Pride is flexible in the beginning. It stretches around humiliation and keeps whispering that the shape will return if you just survive long enough. Credibility dies faster. By the end of the first week, the language my father used in that lobby had already spread through the exact parts of the world I needed most. Not through some screaming public accusation. My family was too polished for that. They did it the elegant way. Investor calls. Private notes. Careful introductions. Tiny warnings disguised as concern. Gifted, but difficult. Brilliant, but unstable. Not commercially mature. Too attached to the architecture. The phrase that really stuck was the worst one because it sounded almost fair. Adrian is extraordinary, but not someone you can safely build a company around. Once enough expensive people hear that sentence, it becomes harder to disprove than fraud. At first I thought talent would outrun it. That was one of the last naive things I believed. I still had the kernel in my head. I still had notebooks full of logic maps, recursion notes, trust inheritance models, and the earliest sketches of the survival path. I still knew more about the engine than the entire new leadership team combined. If anyone had put me in a room with a whiteboard and real questions, I could have made their CTO sit up straight in under 10 minutes. But nobody wanted a whiteboard. They wanted certainty. And my family had already taught the market that I was the uncertainty. I cashed the $10,000 check because outrage does not pay New York rent. That detail still embarrasses me, though less than it used to. I had no grand backup plan. No hidden savings. No secret investor waiting to write the moral balance of the universe. I had exactly one thing of value, and my family had just taught the world not to touch it if it came with me attached. The money lasted just under 3 months. Not 3 dignified months. 3 ugly months. Broker fees, security deposit, first and last month's rent for the basement apartment in Queens, a used desk chair that broke after 5 weeks, groceries, transit, old credit card debt, one urgent dental bill I could not postpone any longer because the pain had started climbing into my temple. By the end of the 3rd month, the account was nearly empty and I had already started selling anything in the room that looked remotely liquid. The extra monitor went first. Then the better laptop, then the camera I used to document whiteboard diagrams and handwritten proofs. I sold a watch my grandmother gave me when I finished high school. That one hurt more than I expected. Not because it was valuable. Because it made me feel like I was feeding pieces of my old life into a machine that only accepted sacrifice. I took freelance work wherever I could find it. Identity access cleanup for 2 regional dental chains. A VPN recovery job for a logistics firm in Jersey that paid me 3 weeks late and still tried to negotiate the invoice down after I restored their broken auth stack. An emergency weekend contract for a startup whose founder spent half the call explaining how cash constrained they were while standing in front of a wall of custom walnut shelving. The work itself was insulting enough. The way people spoke to me during it was worse. When you've been publicly recast as unstable, everyone hears your competence as temporary and your boundaries as attitude. Clients would ask for impossible turnarounds, then sound surprised when I explained what was actually involved. More than once, someone told me I should be grateful for the opportunity. Opportunity. Like I hadn't built the core of a company now moving toward 9-figure contracts while I was patching neglected systems for men who thought a delayed reply to Slack counted as adversity. Then the freelance work thinned out, and I took a help desk job under a shortened version of my name. That decision broke something in me, not because help desk work is beneath anyone. Honest work is honest work. But because I had spent 2 years building one of the most sophisticated trust engines in the sector, and now I was resetting passwords for executives who treated MFA enrollment like a human rights violation. I spent my days walking men with 7-figure compensation packages through browser cache clears and token refreshes. I listened to vice presidents explain urgency to me as if they had invented time. I watched people who couldn't distinguish identity proofing from email verification wave me off like I was interchangeable plumbing. And then I went home and watched my family on Bloomberg. That was the cruelty. Not poverty by itself. Poverty while your stolen life gets professionally lit. Aurelion kept rising. New headquarters. New enterprise clients. New conference panels. New interviews where my father explained the philosophy of dynamic trust. My mother became the public custodian of the lie, speaking in warm, measured sentences about privacy, stewardship, and responsibility as though she had suffered alongside the code rather than helping drag its author out of the frame. Elise was the cleanest fraud of them all. She became the polished executor of legitimacy, the sibling who operationalized brilliance and turned raw innovation into institutional order. That word, order, appeared in every profile written about her. It made my removal sound not only logical, but generous. They had not just stolen the company. They had made my absence look like maturity. Winter in Queens was the low point. The radiator in the apartment worked when it felt like it, which was rarely when I needed it. The windows leaked cold around the edges no matter how much tape I used. There were nights I slept in my coat and woke up with my jaw aching because I had been clenching my teeth against the cold in my sleep. Some weeks I tracked food by calories per dollar. I became expert at comparing protein bars in bodegas while pretending not to notice who was watching. Once I stood in line at a grocery store with eggs, coffee, and pasta, looked at the total, and quietly put the eggs back because electricity mattered more that week. There are forms of shame nobody warns you about. Not public shame. Not scandal. The private kind. The kind that happens when you start measuring your life in train fare, receipt totals, and how long you can make a packet of soup feel like dinner if you drink enough water first. And still, every year, on the anniversary of the original deployment, I renewed the private survival key. That part matters. Because I could have burned them early. I could have refused the renewal in year 1, when Aurelion was still private and the damage would have been sharp but survivable. I could have done it in year 2, before the roadshow, before the underwriters, before the myth hardened into market value. I thought about it all the time. On the train. At work. In the shower when the hot water still functioned. In the dark when the apartment sounded too empty and my own thoughts became louder than the city. But early revenge would have been emotional. I wanted consequence. I wanted altitude. I wanted every lie they had told about ownership, governance, maturity, and legitimacy to become so expensive that when the truth finally cracked through the surface, it would take their wealth, their status, and the entire carefully lit mythology with it. So I waited. I let them climb. I let them raise capital on a machine that still required my consent to remain alive. I let them teach the market to trust a family that could not have explained the core under oath without drifting into fraud. By the 3rd year, I had debt, migraines, chronic insomnia, one decent coat, and a body that felt older than the age on my license. I also had something much more dangerous than rage. I had patience sharpened into a weapon. And somewhere beneath the polished interfaces, the executive dashboards, the governance papers, and the branding language they wrapped around my work, the kernel was still waiting for a key that only I could provide. Which meant the whole empire was not standing on their success. It was standing on my mercy. And I was almost out of it. The first message came at 2:11 in the morning from an encrypted address with no subject line. It contained one sentence. Your family is lying to the underwriters, and the kernel is already rejecting pieces of their authority. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time, slower, because after 3 years of being treated like a bitter, unstable exile, hope had become harder for me to trust than pain. Pain is honest. Pain does not arrive pretending to help. It does not knock gently. It does not ask you to believe in it. It simply sits down across from you and starts naming things. Hope is more dangerous. Hope looks like rescue until it turns out to be another witness to your humiliation. I closed the laptop and sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark for a long time with the glow of the streetlight leaking through the bad window and painting the room in weak amber. Upstairs, someone flushed a toilet. Pipes banged in the wall. A siren moved somewhere far off toward Queens Boulevard. My life sounded exactly like it had for the past 3 years. Thin walls, cheap heat, and the city continuing as if I had never built anything worth stealing. At 8:04 the next morning, the second message arrived. I wrote part of the root validation audit. He buried it. If you want proof, come alone. There was a time and an address beneath it. A diner near Canal Street. Noon. I spent the next 4 hours deciding whether it was a trap, a prank, or the first honest signal I had received from inside Aurelion since the lockout. I mapped possibilities the way I used to map attack vectors. Legal setup. Internal security bait. Someone from my family trying to see whether I was still watching. Someone genuinely panicking. Someone looking to sell me information. Someone looking for absolution. In the end, curiosity beat caution. Or maybe hunger did. Not literal hunger this time, though I had skipped breakfast. A different kind. The hunger to hear one other person say the thing I had been forced to carry alone for too long. That they had built a public story on top of a private lie. The diner was the kind of place New York keeps by accident rather than by love. Too bright, too cold, stainless steel everywhere, coffee strong enough to strip paint. She was already there in the back booth, facing the door, untouched mug between her hands, coat still on. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back. Tired eyes. The kind of composure that usually belongs to people who have spent years staying calm in rooms where other people got paid more to be wrong. When I stepped up to the booth, she looked at me once and said, "Adrian." Not a question. I sat down. "You emailed me." I did. Her voice was flat in a way I immediately trusted. No performance. No flattering urgency. She wasn't here to dramatize anything. She was here because something technical had crossed over into moral territory, and people built like that usually don't sleep well when it happens. "I'm Mara Chen," she said. "Former senior security architect at Aurelion." Former. That word mattered. Everyone still inside that building had too much to lose by telling the truth. The ones already outside had generally been made too poor, too careful, or too discredited to matter. Former meant she had either quit, been pushed, or both. In companies like mine, those categories usually overlap. "You know who I am," I said. A small flicker moved across her face. Not amusement. Something closer to recognition. "I know who they said you were," she replied. "That's not the same thing." That sentence landed harder than it should have. For 3 years my family had controlled not only the company, but the narrative gravity around it. They didn't need to scream that I was unstable. They just needed to imply it in enough expensive rooms. Give investors the shape of a caution. Give reporters the outline of a difficult genius who could not be trusted with the adult work of stewardship. You hear the same carefully polished distortion often enough, and part of you starts checking yourself for damage. Mara reached into her bag and slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were audit notes. Real ones. Suppressed escalation logs. Root validation warnings. Architecture review comments with timestamps. Internal chat screenshots. 3 separate recommendations for deep review of the kernel's trust continuity model, all deferred, minimized, or reframed by leadership. One line in particular had been highlighted in yellow. Governance abstraction layer may be presenting false continuity to executive authority structures above root trust. I read it twice before looking up. He overrode this? Mara nodded. More than once. Why? Because the banks wanted a cleaner diligence narrative, and your father decided engineering nuance was bad timing. Of course he did. I kept reading. Each page made my pulse steadier. That's the strange thing about proof. People think it excites you. Usually it calms you. There's enormous relief in discovering that reality has left fingerprints after all. He accelerated the IPO after these warnings? I asked. He accelerated because of them, Mara said. He wanted valuation locked before anyone could force an audit deep enough to make the underwriters nervous. I sat back and studied her properly then. No wasted motion. No self-dramatizing anger. Just exhaustion and precision. She looked like someone who had tried the correct channels, watched them fail, and finally decided that if systems refuse to police themselves, then truth has to leak sideways. Why are you showing me this? She stared into the coffee for a second before answering. Because I spent 14 months inside the company watching people rap theater around something they didn't understand. Because every time I raised concerns about the root trust model, Elise called it technical absolutism. Because your father said, in front of 2 VPs and outside counsel, that the market did not need to be burdened with philosophical arguments about legitimacy. Her eyes lifted back to mine. And because they kept talking about you like you were a tragic defect instead of the person who built the thing they were trying to commercialize. There was no self-pity in that last line. Just disgust. I respected that. There's something buried under the visible kernel governance path, she said after a moment. Something deeper than continuity logic. I don't need you to confirm what it is. I just need to know one thing. I said nothing. Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug. If the company keeps moving upward without acknowledging what it did to you, is the system still truly under their control? I held her gaze. No. She nodded once, like she had expected that answer and was relieved by the honesty of hearing it out loud. Good, she said quietly. Then I wasn't imagining the rot. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Plates clattered in the kitchen. Someone near the counter laughed too loudly at something forgettable. Outside, a truck backed up with that mechanical beeping sound cities use instead of apology. Mara pushed one last page across the table. The IPO operations schedule. Bell ceremony timing. Media block. Executive interview sequence. Internal command escalation paths. Incident response leads. Route monitoring coverage during the offering window. Everything my family would need to look invincible while standing on top of a dying secret. That's tonight's final engineering brief, she said. The banks are nervous about optics, so they've got the war room under legal observation. If something starts failing publicly tomorrow, they'll lose precious minutes arguing over disclosure wording before they admit they've got a structural event. I folded the page carefully and slipped it into my coat. You're sure you want to be part of this? Mara shook her head. I'm not part of it. Then she paused. I'm making sure that if consequence shows up, it arrives attached to records. That was a better answer than loyalty. Better than vengeance too. When we stood to leave, she stopped beside the booth and looked at me one last time. I didn't contact you to help you burn it down, she said. I contacted you because if something is coming, I wanted to know whether it would be sabotage or justice. I thought about my father's lobby voice. My mother's soft hand on the papers. Elise correcting me in front of clients like she was already trying on ownership. The basement apartment. The bodega arithmetic. The years they left me to rot while renewing their prestige with my silence. It's justice, I said. Mara held my gaze for a second longer, then gave the smallest nod. Then do it clean. She left without offering a handshake, a favor, or a future. I respected that too. People who understand systems know that sometimes the most honest help is not rescue. It is witness. I sat in the booth for another minute with the folder under my hand and the untouched coffee going cold beside me. For the first time in 3 years, I was no longer carrying the whole truth alone. The Colonel was rotting under my family's lies. The company was climbing anyway. And now, if the market watched them fall, it would not be because I had gone mad in exile. It would be because the structure had already failed, and one other person inside the machine had been honest enough to say so. People misunderstand kill switches. They imagine ego. They imagine a brilliant young founder burying revenge in the code because he cannot bear the thought of losing control. They imagine vanity armed with syntax. A tantrum written in logic. It is a comforting interpretation, especially for people like my family, because if the hidden mechanism is emotional, then the crime becomes mine. The story becomes simpler. The unstable architect planted a bomb. The respectable adults merely failed to find it in time. But the truth is uglier for them than that. Because I did not write the survival key out of spite. I wrote it out of principle. That is what made it so dangerous. Aurelion was built on one belief: no one should be permanently trusted simply because they have title, ownership, or social approval. Not founders. Not trustees. Not executives. Not family. Authority that cannot survive scrutiny is just threat wearing a better suit. The Colonel enforced that belief at every visible layer. Privileges had to keep proving themselves. Trust chains had to remain alive through verification. Escalations were supposed to be difficult because difficulty is what keeps power honest. But there was still a deeper problem. What happens when the system itself is captured by people who technically own it and morally do not deserve it? That was the question that led to the survival path. I wrote the first version of it during the second year, back when the kernel was still small enough that every important decision lived in my head and every major branch of the code carried my fingerprints. At the time, I was thinking about hostile acquisition, coercive governance, state seizure, even death. I needed a mechanism that would prevent the kernel from becoming the obedient property of anyone who could manipulate paper better than they could understand architecture. So I gave it a conscience. Not a human conscience. Something colder. More exact. Once every 365 days, the original architect had to renew a private root authorization path through an offline channel buried below the visible governance model. It wasn't a backdoor. Backdoors are secret permissions. This was the opposite. It was a continuing proof requirement. A living confirmation that the foundation still recognized the legitimacy of the world built above it. If the renewal key arrived, the kernel remained alive and whole. The trust engine continued to honor the governance structures layered over it. Clients saw stability. Executives saw authority. Shareholders saw continuity. Everything worked. If the key did not arrive, the kernel interpreted that absence as meaningful. Not an error. A judgment. And once the judgment started, the process was elegantly cruel. First, root continuity began to decay in places only serious engineers would notice. Executive trust inheritance grew brittle. Admin authority still looked valid, but under load it stopped propagating cleanly across the deepest trust maps. Then recovery ladders began authenticating without restoring real legitimacy. That's one of my favorite parts of the design, even now. Powerful people would believe they still had recourse because the system allowed them to see the shape of control while quietly removing its substance. After that came policy drift. Then permission fracture. Then a widening gap between what the company believed it commanded and what the kernel still recognized as sovereign. Eventually the whole machine would reach the only conclusion available to a structure honest enough to distrust power. If the people above me no longer deserve recognition, I will stop extending it. That is what my family dragged onto the stock exchange. A living encryption core whose continued legitimacy still required a key only I could provide. And for 3 years after they stole it, I did provide it. That matters. The easiest version of this story would cast me as a patient avenger who buried a future explosion and waited with theatrical certainty for the perfect day to trigger it. Reality was less cinematic and more disciplined. Every year, on the anniversary of the original deployment, I opened the private channel, fed the renewal string into the root path, and let Aurelion keep living. Not for them. For timing. An early collapse would have hurt my family. It might even have damaged them badly. But it would not have done what I needed it to do. It would not have stripped away the mythology. It would not have exposed the public lie. It would not have placed their signatures, their certifications, their prospectus language, their governance claims, and their polished executive faces under the bright and legally expensive light of the market. I did not want revenge in private. I wanted consequence in public. That is the difference between anger and design. Mara's folder gave me the last piece I needed. Up until then, my family's guilt had been moral, structural, and personal. They had stolen the kernel. Stolen my place in its history. Stolen the company. Erased me. Left me to starve while they learned to wear trust like jewelry. But the IPO changed the scale of what they were doing. The audit logs proved they were no longer merely living off a theft. They were actively lying to underwriters and public markets about a root architecture they had never controlled and could no longer honestly describe. That transformed the whole event. The offering was no longer just a grotesque celebration of betrayal. It was an expensive act of fraud built on top of a machine that had already begun withdrawing belief. The night before the bell, I sat in my apartment with Mara's engineering brief spread open beside the terminal and the window leaking cold air onto my shoulder. I read every line again. The roadshow schedule. The command chain. The legal observation procedures in the war room. The final pre-IPO status notes. Their entire confidence rested on one assumption, that because the Colonel had obeyed them for 3 years, it would continue to do so forever. That was the arrogance at the center of everything. They mistook tolerated occupation for ownership. On the screen, the warning had already turned yellow. Manual root renewal window, open. Last safe authorization point, approaching. Failure to renew will trigger self-revocation cascade. There was still time. That is important too. Ashfall, though I had called it Lifeline in the earliest notes and only later named its failure state, was not a cheap trap. It gave room for truth. It gave time for confession. It gave the people above it one final chance to stop pretending. All my family had to do was say the words. Admit I built it. Admit they stole it. Admit the company was resting on a key they did not own. They never would. I knew that before the market opened. But the architecture itself still offered the possibility. Because systems built with ethics should always leave one narrow path for honesty, even when the people using them are not honest enough to take it. At 8:57 the next morning, before CNBC had even finished setting the tone for the day, I sat at the desk in the cold room and watched the final renewal window close. No dramatic command. No cinematic flourish. I didn't type anything. I simply refused to save them. That was the whole act. Refusal. Sometimes the harshest power in the world is not pulling a trigger. It is declining to give legitimacy to people who built their empire on the assumption that you always would. The terminal updated. Manual root renewal, not received. Survival timer, active. Self-revocation cascade, armed. Then the market opened, and my family, standing under exchange lights with perfect posture and stolen confidence, began introducing the public to a kingdom that still needed my key to survive. The stock opened at $42 and rose so fast the anchors started laughing. That was the first thing that made the moment feel unreal. Not the cameras. Not the banners. Not my father standing under the NYSE lights wearing my future like a tailored suit. It was the laughter. The delighted, mindless confidence of people watching money move upward and mistaking motion for safety. Aurelion hit 46 in less than 2 minutes. Then 49. Then 53. On television, my father was glowing. My mother had that warm, polished expression she used when she wanted powerful people to imagine her as the human face of discipline. Elise stood just behind them, one hand folded over the other, all controlled elegance and executive calm. From a distance they looked like what the market wanted them to be, the ideal founding family, united by intelligence, sacrifice, and strategic clarity. I knew better. I also knew that for the next few minutes, none of that knowledge would matter to anyone except me. Because greed always rises before truth catches up. On my center screen, the terminal remained almost insultingly plain. Survival timer, 0:41 and 16 seconds. Root authority, degrading. Executive trust inheritance, unstable. The words did not need drama. The drama would arrive on its own. My phone buzzed again. Dad. This time I didn't answer. I just watched it pulse across the desk, listened to the television, and let him sit inside his panic a little longer. He had made me do that for 3 years. Not with phone calls. With life. With silence. With reputation. With rooms that closed because he had spoken first in them. He could wait. At 9:44, the first external warning appeared. Not publicly. Not yet. It came through the engineering channels Mara had shown me how to track without touching anything traceable. A large banking client had lost administrative continuity across a recovery cluster. The credentials looked valid. The dashboard looked normal. But the trust chain underneath it no longer recognized the authority trying to travel through it. That is what collapse looks like when it is written correctly. It does not begin with flames. It begins with recognition quietly withdrawing. The engineers marked it Sev 2. Then Sev 1 4 minutes later when the issue spread to a second environment in a different region. Someone at Aurelion typed the phrase possible root continuity anomaly. Another person deleted it and replaced it with temporary load-related instability. That made me smile for the first time all morning. Corporate language is such a fragile little shield. It works only as long as reality is polite enough to wait. On CNBC, one of the anchors was asking my father about market expansion into Europe when I saw it, that microscopic delay in his expression right after an aide stepped into frame and whispered something at his shoulder. He recovered fast. Of course he did. That was the whole performance. But he was no longer fully inside the interview. Part of him had already moved elsewhere, toward a set of screens he did not understand and a problem he could not bully into behaving. Aurelion hit $56. Then 58. My put options looked ridiculous. For a moment, I was down so much that an ordinary person might have panicked. Months of scraping, saving, starving, and betting every last surviving dollar against this moment, and the market was still treating my family like profits. That is another thing people misunderstand about revenge. The truth is rarely rewarded immediately. Usually it gets mocked first. At 9:51, the second fault surfaced. A healthcare client running high-sensitivity archival storage through Aurelion's enterprise stack reported contradictory trust validations across the same encrypted environment. One branch was authenticating. Another was rejecting the exact same inherited authority. That should not have been possible if the governance structure above the kernel was still coherent. Which, of course, it wasn't. Not anymore. My phone vibrated again. Then again. Then a text from my mother. Pick up. Please. We just need to understand what the engineers are seeing. Understand. That word almost made me laugh out loud. 3 years earlier, none of them had wanted understanding. They wanted control. Packaging. Optics. They wanted my code without my inconvenient insistence on truth. They wanted the machine but not the maker, the value but not the authority that came with actually knowing what lived beneath the surface. Now, with billions of dollars and cameras pointed at them, they wanted to understand. Too late. At 9:56, CNBC stopped using celebratory language. Not all at once. They didn't have the courage for that. Instead, the mood shifted by degrees. The host's tone tightened. A lower third banner changed from Aurelion soars in blockbuster debut to reports of early technical issues as Aurelion trades higher. There it was. The first crack in the public story. On my terminal, the timer dropped below 30 minutes. Survival timer, 0:29 and 58 seconds. Self-revocation cascade, stage 2. I finally answered when my father called again. He did not say hello. What did you do? He was breathing too hard. Behind his voice I could hear movement, sharp footsteps, someone else on another call, the muffled rhythm of public panic trying to stay indoors. Nothing, I said. Don't do that. Do what? Play games with me. I looked at the television. He was no longer on the floor. The camera had lost him. Good. The first retreat. The root layer is rejecting executive inheritance, he said. The engineers are saying there's some kind of survival path failure. They can't stabilize continuity. What does that mean? I let the silence sit between us. Then I said, it means the kernel has stopped recognizing people who were never supposed to control it. He exhaled sharply. Adrian, listen to me carefully. We can fix this. But I need you to tell me what this is. You know what it is? No, I know what the logs say. I want to know what you buried in the core. That word again. Buried. As if the hidden mechanism had been an act of malice instead of the only honest part of the entire structure. I didn't bury anything, I said. I built a foundation that required legitimacy. On screen, the stock dipped for the first time. 58 to 52 in less than a minute. Then 49. Traders can smell fear before executives admit it exists. At 10:02, the first major sell-off began. Not because clients had fully understood the issue yet, but because money is a coward. It sees uncertainty and starts heading for the door before language catches up. One of the CNBC panelists said the phrase undisclosed architectural dependency risk. Good. Very good. That phrase would get copied into legal memos before noon. My father lowered his voice. Tell me what you want. There it was. Not love. Not family. Not apology. Terms. Everything in him still believed this was a deal waiting to be priced. I stood up from the desk and crossed to the window, one hand on the sill, looking out at the gray wet street below. A woman in a red coat was dragging a child by the hand through puddles. A delivery guy was balancing coffee trays at a crosswalk. The city looked ordinary in exactly the way it always does while lives are being destroyed somewhere above its awareness. I want the truth, I said. Silence. Then, cautious, what truth? I closed my eyes for 1 second and saw the whole thing, the folder on my birthday, the red access light in the rain, the $10,000 check, the bodega arithmetic, the years they let me shrink while they grew fat inside my name. Say you didn't build it, I said. Say you took it. Say I wrote the kernel and you pushed me out anyway. His answer came too fast. Adrian, if I say that now, I go to prison. Yes, I said. The stock dropped below the offering price. 42. Then 37. Then 31. On TV, the anchors had gone from celebratory to clinical. They were no longer narrating a triumph. They were documenting a developing liability event. At 10:08, my mother texted. "Please. We are family." I looked at the message for a long time. Family. Such a soft word for a thing that can be weaponized so efficiently. I typed one sentence back. "You stopped being family when you made the market trust your faces more than the truth." Then I turned the phone face down. On the terminal, the timer fell below 10 minutes. Survival timer, 0:09 and 41 seconds. Root fracture, irreversible. That was the point of no return. The engineers would know it before the executives did. Someone smart, deep in a war room, was probably staring at the logs with the exact kind of frozen understanding I used to see in myself when a proof collapsed in a way that could not be negotiated with. They would try restarts, layer isolation, recovery authentication, governance patching. But the kernel no longer believed in the structures making those requests. And systems built with principles are crueler than systems built with greed. Because greed can bargain. Principle just watches the clock. The final call came from Elise. I almost didn't answer, almost. When I did, she was no longer the polished operator from the interviews. Her breath was shaking. Her voice was too high. The executive mask had cracked at last, and underneath it was exactly what I expected, not competence, just panic with excellent clothes. "What is the survival key?" I leaned back against the window. "You really don't know?" "Adrian, stop." "No," I said quietly. "You stop. For 3 years you spoke about governance, order, stewardship, maturity. You sat in rooms and explained my work like it had happened to you. If you want the answer now, say the truth first." She made a sound halfway between a laugh and a choke. "You're doing this on IPO day?" "Yes. This will destroy us." I looked at the terminal. At the clock. At the green text preparing to become red. "You did that first," I said. Then I ended the call. At 10:14, Aurelion hit $19. Trading halted. The entire floor on CNBC changed. No more smiling. No more adjectives. Just analysts, legal experts, breaking banners, and confusion hardening into the first shape of scandal. My center screen flashed once. Then red. The kernel had made its decision. And all my family could do now was watch the market learn what I had known from the beginning. They had taken my kingdom public. But they had never owned the key that kept it alive. At 10:17, the halt was lifted. Aurelion reopened at $12. For 8 seconds, it looked like the market might try to save them. Then reality arrived all at once. The stock dropped to 9. Then 6. Then 4. On CNBC, the anchors stopped saying technical issue and started saying structural failure. The panel changed. Out went the smiling market commentators. In came the litigation analysts, the former regulators, the sort of men and women who speak in measured tones about disaster because they have built careers standing near the smoking remains of expensive lies. By 10:26, one of them used the phrase possible offering fraud tied to undisclosed kernel dependency risk. That was the moment I knew my family was finished. Not because the stock was dying. Because the language around the death had changed. Money can survive panic. Companies can survive outages. Executives can survive one bad quarter, one ugly article, even one humiliating trading day if the underlying story remains salvageable. But once the market stops asking, can they fix it? And starts asking, did they know? The blood enters the water at the regulatory level. And nobody survives that elegantly. The terminal on my desk had stopped counting down. The process had completed. No fireworks. No giant final line declaring vengeance served. Just a sequence of last reports in flat, indifferent text. Root fracture, complete. Survival path, terminated. Kernel status, self-revoked. Continuity restoration, not possible. I stared at those lines longer than I expected to. For 3 years, Aurelion had been two things at once in my head, my greatest creation and the cleanest weapon I had ever had. Now one half of that equation was gone. The machine they stole from me, the exact machine I built in my grandmother's laundry room with cold hands, no money, and more belief than discipline, had just killed itself rather than continue recognizing the people who had dragged it away from me. That should have felt purely triumphant. It didn't. There was satisfaction, yes. Cold, dense, undeniable satisfaction. But braided through it was grief. Not for my family. Not for the stock. Not even for the clients, not yet. For the kernel itself. For the original thing. For the clean idea before money got its teeth into it. I had not merely let my family's company die. I had watched part of my own mind choose not to survive them. My phone began vibrating again, this time so constantly it looked more like a seizure than a call. Dad. Mom. Elise. Unknown numbers. Probably counsel. Probably underwriters. Possibly reporters already tracing names backward through the mess. I muted the device and turned my attention back to the right monitor. My puts had detonated. The numbers no longer looked real. The account balance flickered upward in brutal increments as volatility expanded and the floor continued dissolving beneath Aurelion's valuation. Every month of compromise, every cold week, every grocery receipt calculation, every hour spent riding the train home after resetting passwords for executives too careless to deserve the access they took for granted, it all sat there on the screen being translated into something the market actually respected. Money. That part felt ugly. Useful. Necessary. But ugly. Because I had not wanted to become the kind of man who experiences justice primarily through a profit and loss statement. And yet there it was, glowing back at me in clean financial language. The world that ignored my suffering was perfectly willing to acknowledge my value once it arrived dressed as a trade. I sold enough of the position to lock in freedom, then left the rest to bleed with the market. By noon, Aurelion was under $2. By 1, trading was halted again. By 3, the board had announced an emergency internal review, outside counsel had been retained, and the underwriters had issued the kind of carefully disgusted statement institutions use when they have decided to preserve themselves by pretending they were shocked by the behavior they absolutely encouraged as long as it was profitable. The first lawsuit hit before dinner. The second before midnight. Mara sent me one message around 6. They're preserving evidence. Legal has frozen leadership email. Your father is screaming at everyone. I read it twice, then typed back. Good. That night I did something I had not done in years. I ordered real food, not noodles. Not bodega protein bars. Not eggs and rice calculated against utility notices. I ordered from a Thai place 4 blocks away that I used to pass on the walk home from the train, smelling garlic and basil and meat in hot oil and pretending I wasn't hungry enough to notice. When the delivery guy handed me the bag, I tipped him $40 and he looked at me like he thought I might be drunk. I wasn't. I was just tired of scarcity making every decent gesture feel extravagant. I ate half of it at the desk while watching replay footage of my family leaving the exchange floor. That was the footage every network kept using. Not the bell. Not the smiles. The retreat. My father moving too fast, face tight, no longer dignified enough to disguise urgency as control. My mother pale, jaw locked, trying to preserve posture while her eyes betrayed the terror she could no longer smooth over. Elise speaking sharply to someone off camera, all the elegant composure gone, replaced by the frantic authority of a person whose job has always been to manage optics and who has just discovered that optics are useless when the foundation itself revolts. They looked smaller every time the loop ran. By midnight, my voicemail box was full. At 1:13 a.m., I finally listened to one. It was my father. No anger now. No theatrics. No carefully managed phrasing. Just the voice of a man who had lived too long believing every collapse was temporary because he had never before been inside one of his own. Adrian, he said, and for a second he almost sounded like my father from before ambition ate whatever softness he had started with. We need to talk. Tonight. This doesn't have to become what they're making it. There are explanations. There are ways to position this. You're emotional right now, and I understand that, but there are still options if you stop and think. I laughed. Alone in the basement room, with cold leftover noodles from a different life still somewhere in the trash and market blood all over the television, I laughed so hard my chest hurt. There are still options. That was my father in a single sentence. The building could be on fire, the exits locked, the structural supports collapsing, and he would still be standing there trying to negotiate the vocabulary of smoke. I deleted the voicemail. Then I opened a clean document and began organizing everything I had. Mara's logs. The original architectural notes. Timestamp development records. The private renewal history proving I had been the one keeping the kernel alive while my family represented Aurelion as fully controlled and sustainably governed. I was done with private justice. The market had broken them first. Now the records would finish the job. Outside, the city kept moving, tires on wet pavement. Sirens. Someone shouting down the block. The basement apartment felt exactly the same as it had that morning. Same bad window. Same weak radiator. Same cracked tile under my feet. That mattered. Because revenge does not magically turn the room noble. It just changes what the room means. This morning it had been the place where a man in exile watched his family celebrate the theft of his life. Now it was the room where I began building what came after them. Not another collapse. Not just more punishment. The next thing. The clean thing. The thing they would never again be allowed to touch. I opened a new terminal window. For a moment I just stared at the blank prompt while the television replayed my family's public unraveling in the corner of my eye. Then I typed a single line. Project Phoenix, initialize. That was the real ending of the day. Not the halt. Not the market crash. Not my father's broken voice on voicemail. This. The first line of the life they had tried to erase. Because they had taken my kernel public. They had stolen my name, my place, my future, and tried to turn me into a cautionary footnote in my own story. What they forgot was simple. You can steal a company. You can steal credit. You can steal years. But if the mind that built the core survives you, then you have not won. You have only delayed the moment it begins again.